The Consumer Price Index, part of our lecture series on inflation. In this video, we'll discuss how we define the Consumer Price Index, what the Consumer Price Index looks like over time, and we'll spend a moment talking about which price index you want to use. We talked about in a previous video inflation being an overall rise in the price level, and again, it must be an overall rise. And you might wonder how the United States calculates this kind of overall price rise. And the United States calculates it by looking at a bundle of consumer goods and how that bundle of consumer goods, the pricing of that has changed over time. And that measure we call the Consumer Price Index. Now, in a previous series of lectures, we talked about the GDP deflator, which is another way to compare prices over time. The Consumer Price Index is really focused more on the consumer experience with price increases and inflation. There are two flavors of Consumer Price Index. There's the full Consumer Price Index, which is a little more volatile, and that's used for a lot of governmental purposes, such as thinking about tax brackets, Social Security benefits, some union wages, other adjustments like that use the full Consumer Price Index. The more stable core Consumer Price Index takes the whole basket of goods, but it leaves out food and energy. And this is actually a better index for comparing prices over time, even though it's not as good at sort of adjusting for cost of living prices. So the Consumer Price Index is really a measure of the price of consumption, and it focuses on urban consumers. So this survey of a basket of goods started in 1921, so it's almost 100 years old. Maybe by the time you're watching this, it'll be more than 100 years old. And so those are actual data that we have. We've also made estimates of price levels back to 1774. This shows you that those price levels are the earlier estimates. And this is indexed so that 1982 to 1984 is 100. And so what are the relative prices of 1982 to 1984 or 100? Well, if you go back, you can sort of see that basically the story of consumer prices is kind of a two-phase story, where the first 3/4 of this graph, the prices look pretty stable up until about 1944. And then after that, there's a slow rise and then a much quicker rise in prices after that point. I'm going to explain in a later video why the first 3/4 of this look so stable. You'll notice that the little bumps that you see, like around 1814 and around 1864 and around 1914, are during wars, and that's not an accident. I've plotted this same graph, except that I've changed the y-axis now. So the units get larger as you go up on an exponential basis. We call this a log scale. And so what you'll see is this allows us to see the earlier changes more clearly. And again, these early bumps are correlated with wars that America was in at the time. So you know two price indices now. You know about the GDP deflator and you know about the Consumer Price Index. Both of these accomplish the same goal of comparing prices over time. In general, the Consumer Price Index is a better measure if you're looking at consumer prices, and the GDP deflator is a better measure of large costs or government expenditures. There are other price indices. We talked briefly about the purchasing power parity when we compare prices across countries. There's also a producer price index in the US to talk about producer prices over time. There's also average household expenditures. There are different indices that we can use, and we use them in slightly different situations. But the key thing to remember is that unless you're an economist, it doesn't really matter which price index you use, as long as you use one, as long as you account for the fact that even over a 5-year period of time, prices do change, and you want to account for that. And I've given you a site here, measuringworth.com, which is very useful, again, run by economists with a lot of data about how to account for price changes over time. So the Consumer Price Index measures the price level over time, and I want to make sure you understand or remember that you use an index, any index, when you compare prices from the past. Thank you.